The woman on the third floor of the Clement Street building had been putting out a small pot of coffee on her windowsill every morning for 11 years, and she had no idea why she did it. That is not entirely accurate. She knew the surface reason, the ritual reason, the story she told herself when she thought about it, which was that her grandmother had done the same thing in a different city in a different decade and that the habit had passed between them the way habits pass, through proximity and repetition and the particular human tendency to continue doing things that feel right without examining too carefully why they feel right. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the morning 11 years ago when she had first put the coffee out had been the morning after a night when Harry Callahan had stood in the alley behind her building for 4 hours, watching a man who had been watching her, and that the man had eventually concluded. From something in the quality of Harry's presence in that alley, from the specific communication that Harry's stillness made to anyone with enough experience in violence to read it correctly, that the particular apartment he had been planning to enter was not worth the risk of entering, and had moved on, and had eventually been arrested for an unrelated offense 6 months later, and had gone to prison, and had never returned to Clement Street. The woman did not know any of this. She knew the coffee felt right in the morning. She knew the windowsill was the correct place for it. She knew that her apartment had always felt, for reasons she had never examined, like a safe place, and she attributed this feeling to the neighborhood, to the building's good bones, to whatever combination of luck and judgment had led her to choose this particular address in this particular city. She was not wrong to feel safe. She had simply never known the specific and unrepeatable reason why. This is the arithmetic of what Harry Callahan did, accumulated over 26 years of San Francisco streets and cases and situations that the official record captured in fragments and that the actual texture of the city absorbed without acknowledgement. The arithmetic is not dramatic in its individual entries. A woman who doesn't know she is safe, a corner that is slightly less dangerous than it would otherwise be, a family that goes about its life without understanding the specific threat that was removed from its vicinity by someone who will never appear in any story they tell about their lives. The arithmetic becomes significant only in aggregate, only when you attempt to add up the full ledger of Harry Callahan's 26 years and confront the sum. The number of ordinary mornings that happened because he was present the night before, the number of lives that continued in their ordinary continuity because something that would have interrupted them was interrupted first. Nobody ever attempted this addition. Nobody had the data for it, because the data lived in the negative space of what didn't happen, in the cases that were resolved before they generated official records, in the situations that were neutralized before they became situations in the documented sense. The ledger was real. The city had benefited from it for 26 years. The city had never once looked at it. Harry understood this about the city long before he reached the point in his career where understanding it might have produced bitterness, and the fact that it didn't produce bitterness is itself something worth examining, because the relationship most people have with sustained, unacknowledged sacrifice tends toward resentment in inverse proportion to how long the sacrifice continues. Harry's relationship with his city's ingratitude was something different. Not acceptance exactly, which implies having processed something and arrived at peace with it, and not indifference, which implies not caring about it in the first place. It was something closer to a structural understanding, a comprehension of why the city couldn't acknowledge what Harry did that was deep enough to remove the expectation of acknowledgement rather than simply absorbing its disappointment. Cities do not know what they are protected from. This is not a moral failing of cities. It is the nature of protection successfully applied. The woman on Clement Street did not know about the man in the alley behind her building because Harry's presence in that alley had made the knowledge unnecessary, had prevented the event that would have generated the knowledge from occurring. The protection was its own erasure. The more completely it worked, the less visible it was. And Harry, who had understood this dynamic from early in his career, had organized his relationship with it accordingly, not seeking the visibility that successful protection made impossible, not needing the acknowledgement that the very completeness of his work prevented the city from offering. He simply did the work. The work disappeared into the city's texture. The city continued. This was the arrangement, and Harry had made his peace with it in a way that most people, contemplating it from outside, found either admirable or slightly disturbing, depending on what they believed people were owed for the things they gave. The specific invisibility of Harry Callahan's contribution to San Francisco was not a feature of the cases that generated official records. Those existed, were documented, were closed with his name attached in the correct procedural places. The invisibility was a feature of everything else, of the vast surrounding territory of action and presence and deterrence that the official record had no mechanism for capturing because it operated, by definition, outside the circumstances that generated official records. A crime prevented is not a case. A threat neutralized before it threatens is not a file. A man who decides not to do a thing he was planning to do, because something in the geography of his intended action has shifted in a way he can't entirely name, generates no documentation anywhere. Harry Callahan spent 26 years producing this kind of result alongside the documented kind, and the proportion of his actual contribution to the city that the documentation captured was, in his own private assessment, modest. The cases were real. The closed files mattered. But the woman on Clement Street, and the family in the Richmond whose house was not broken into on a Tuesday night in 1974, and the young man in the Tenderloin who chose a different corner because a certain unmarked sedan had been parked on his usual one more evenings than was comfortable. These were also real, and they were also his, and they existed in a ledger that had no official form and that the city would never audit and that Harry would carry alone for the rest of his life, because carrying things alone was what 26 years of this work had built him to do. There is a particular kind of loneliness that attaches to being the person who knows things other people don't know, not because the knowledge is secret in any deliberate sense but because the knowledge exists in a category that the people around you have no framework for receiving. Harry Callahan knew, in the specific and detailed way of someone who had been present, what San Francisco had come close to on dozens of occasions over his career. Knew the specific faces and names and intentions that had been removed or redirected from the city's streets by his presence and his work, knew the specific texture of what the city had avoided and the specific cost of the avoiding. He knew the woman on Clement Street not by name but by the address and the date and the 4 hours in the alley, and he carried that knowledge without any corresponding knowledge on her part, without any acknowledgement from her or from anyone that the knowledge mattered, without any mechanism by which the ledger could be balanced in any social or emotional sense. This is not a complaint, because Harry did not experience it as a grievance. But it is an honest account of what the work cost him in a dimension that nobody discussed when they discussed the costs of Harry Callahan's methods, which was the dimension of human acknowledgement, the basic social transaction through which people understand themselves to have mattered to the people and places they have given things to. Harry was owed an enormous amount of this transaction from the city of San Francisco. The city had no idea the debt existed. The city went on its way, foggy and beautiful and rotten and inexhaustible, entirely unconscious of the specific shape of what it had received and from whom and at what cost. Lieutenant Bressler's retirement remarks, the ones about people who had given the job something you couldn't get back, had been as close as anyone in Harry's professional life ever came to naming the actual shape of what Harry had given the city over 26 years. They had not named it directly, because the direct naming would have required acknowledging things that the department had spent 26 years carefully not acknowledging officially, and Bressler was too much of an institutional man, even at his retirement, to step fully outside the institutional language that had governed his entire career. But the people in that break room who had understood the subtext had understood it completely, and for a few minutes on that afternoon with the bad coffee and the sheet cake, something had passed between the people in that room that was as close to genuine acknowledgement as Harry's specific kind of service was ever going to receive within the professional context that had been its home. Harry had received it in the flat, still way he received everything that called for visible emotion, which was without visible emotion and with a quality of internal attention that registered the moment accurately and filed it in the correct place without allowing it to alter his surface presentation. He had left before the cake was finished. The acknowledgement, such as it was, had been enough, not because it was sufficient to balance the ledger but because Harry had long since stopped expecting the ledger to be balanced and had simply been, in that break-room moment, given something small and genuine that he had not expected, which was its own category of gift precisely because it was unexpected. The retired firefighter who lived on the ground floor of Harry's building on Vallejo Street had told him once, in a conversation that had developed unexpectedly from a shared elevator and a comment about the fog, that the thing nobody prepared you for about the job was coming home to people who couldn't understand what you'd been inside all day. Not because they didn't care, the firefighter had said, but because there was no language bridge between the inside of the work and the outside of it, no way to translate what you'd been doing into something that could be received by someone who hadn't been there, and after enough years of trying and failing to make the translation, most people simply stopped trying and accepted that the inside and the outside were separate countries, and you lived in both but you were only fully real in one. Harry had listened to this with the flat attention he brought to things that were accurate, and had said nothing in response, because there was nothing to add that would improve on it. The firefighter had gotten off at the second floor and Harry had continued to the fourth, and the conversation had ended, and he had never had it again with anyone, but he had thought about it occasionally in the years that followed because it had named, more precisely than anything else he had encountered, the specific quality of the distance between what Harry Callahan knew about San Francisco and what San Francisco knew about itself. The families of people Harry had protected without their knowledge outnumbered, by an order of magnitude, the families of people whose protection had generated a case file. This was not a statistic anyone had calculated, because the data for calculating it lived only in Harry's memory and in the behavior of people who had made different decisions because of his presence and who had no reason to connect their decisions to him. But Harry had his own informal accounting, maintained not as a record but as a kind of peripheral awareness, the sense of a territory of effect that extended far beyond what was visible, that included the Clement Street woman and the Richmond family and 100 other addresses and situations and faces whose connection to Harry was invisible to them and precisely known to him. This territory was not a source of pride exactly. Pride required a kind of external validation that the invisible territory could not provide, required being seen in the giving of what you had given. Harry's relationship to what he had given the city was something closer to simple ownership, the knowledge that a thing had been done, that it had mattered, that the mattering was real regardless of whether it was visible. He owned the mattering. The city benefited from it. The transaction was incomplete in every social and emotional sense and entirely complete in the only sense that Harry had ever found sufficient, which was the operational sense, the question of whether the thing had been accomplished, the answer to which was yes, across 26 years and a territory of effect that no official document would ever fully map. The city's ingratitude was not personal. This is worth saying clearly, because the most natural reading of sustained unacknowledged service is as a personal slight, as evidence of the specific indifference of a specific place toward a specific person, and this reading, while emotionally intuitive, misses what Harry had understood about it. San Francisco was not indifferent to Harry Callahan. San Francisco was unaware of Harry Callahan in the specific way that a living organism is unaware of the particular cells whose function maintains its health, not because it doesn't benefit from them, but because the benefit is so thoroughly integrated into ordinary functioning that the cells never become visible except when they fail. Harry had never failed in a way that made him visible as a failure. He had succeeded in ways that made him visible as a problem. The internal affairs files, the use of force reviews, the formal reprimands, all the documentation of the gap between his methods and the institution's authorized parameters. The city had a record of Harry Callahan's costs and no record of his benefits, which produced, for anyone reading only the official documentation, a portrait of an officer whose career represented a long-running institutional liability rather than a long-running institutional asset. The portrait was accurate about the costs and silent about the benefits, and the silence was structural rather than deliberate, the inevitable result of a system that documented what went wrong and absorbed without recording what went right, that generated paper every time Harry exceeded his authority and generated nothing when the exceeding produced the outcomes that made it necessary. This structural silence was what the city owed Harry the most profound acknowledgement for, and it was the acknowledgement the city was least equipped to make, because making it would have required the city to confront the discrepancy between its official portrait of Harry and its actual experience of him. To acknowledge that the 400 pages of internal affairs file represented the visible surface of a career whose actual substance was invisible to the official record, that the man the documentation described as a persistent institutional liability had been, for 26 years, one of the city's most durable and irreplaceable institutional assets. This confrontation would have been uncomfortable. It would have required the people who maintained the official record to acknowledge that the record was incomplete in ways that were not accidental but structural, that the incompleteness was not a failure of documentation but a feature of how documentation worked when applied to the kind of work Harry did. Nobody in the department's history had ever initiated this confrontation. Nobody outside it had ever been in a position to. The discrepancy persisted, unconfronted, absorbed into the permanent background of institutional self-understanding the way that all unconfronted discrepancies eventually are, not resolved, simply present, living in the gap between what the record said and what the people who had been there long enough knew. Harry drove north on the Tuesday morning of his departure without any expectation that this would change. He had never expected it to change. Expectation had never been part of his relationship with the city's acknowledgement, because expectation required projecting a future in which the city might behave differently, and Harry had spent too long watching San Francisco be exactly what it was to project a different version of it. The city was what it was. It produced what it produced. It gave what it gave, which was the work, and the work was what Harry had come for, and the work had been done, and the city had received it without knowing it, and that was the full account of the transaction between them, complete in its terms if not in its reciprocity, honest in its mechanics if not in its balance, real in every particular that mattered operationally and silent in every particular that mattered humanly. Harry was at peace with this the same way he was at peace with most things about the city, not because the peace had been achieved through some process of acceptance or resolution, but because the alternative to peace was a form of engagement with the city's nature that the city's nature did not support and that Harry had stopped attempting long ago. The fog closed behind him as the car moved north. The city disappeared. The silence it had kept about him for 26 years continued, as silence does, in his absence, indistinguishable from all the other silences that San Francisco kept about all the other people who had given things to it and not been thanked, which was most of them, which was the nature of cities, which was simply what was true. What remained, after the drive and the fog and the city's disappearance in the rearview mirror, was what always remained, the weight of the knowing, the private ledger, the specific and detailed understanding of what had been given and where it had gone and what it had protected and how little of that protection had ever been visible to the people who had received it. Harry carried this not as a burden in any active sense but in the way that formed things are carried. As part of the shape you have taken, present not because you are holding it but because it is part of how you are built, because the 26 years of giving things to a city that didn't know you were giving them had produced a person who was permanently constituted by the giving, who was, in some fundamental architectural sense, made of it. The woman on Clement Street would put out her coffee again tomorrow morning, as she had every morning for 11 years, for reasons she would not examine and would not need to examine, in an apartment that felt safe for reasons she had never traced to their source and would never trace. And Harry Callahan, driving north in the fog, would carry the knowledge of the source, and the woman would carry the safety, and the city would carry neither and know nothing, and this would be, as it had always been, the complete and sufficient and entirely unbalanced account of what it meant to be the person who stood in the gap, to give the thing that made the city livable and to receive, in return, the city's perfect and permanent and utterly unconscious silence. The mechanics of the city's ingratitude operated through layers that Harry had mapped over his career with the same methodical attention he brought to case files. The first and most obvious layer was institutional. The department's documented relationship with Harry, which consisted almost entirely of reviews and reprimands and formal notifications of exceeding authorized parameters, and which would serve, for any future archivist reviewing the records, as a portrait of a liability rather than an asset. This layer was real. The costs were real. The institutional anxiety was real. But the institutional anxiety existed, Harry had always understood, in a particular relationship with the institutional benefit. The anxiety was visible because the benefit was invisible, and the benefit was invisible because it had been successfully delivered, and successful delivery was precisely the condition that prevented visibility. The department feared what Harry costed in procedural terms and depended on what Harry produced in operational terms, and these two things existed in a permanent and unresolvable tension that the department managed by acknowledging the first loudly and the second never, because acknowledging the second would have required confronting what the department's own authorized methods were insufficient to produce. The institutional ingratitude was not malicious. It was structural. It was the ingratitude of a system that had no mechanism for recording what it owed and no incentive to develop one. The second layer was civic, the city's relationship with Harry as a public institution, which was to say no relationship at all, because Harry had never been a public figure in any sense that the city's civic attention registered. He had not sought press coverage of his work. He had not cultivated relationships with journalists or politicians or community leaders who might have served as conduits between what Harry did and what the city understood was being done on its behalf. He had, in fact, actively avoided such relationships, not out of false modesty but out of a genuine understanding that visibility of the kind civic recognition required was incompatible with the kind of work he did. The work that needed doing in the gaps between official process and actual outcome required operating in those gaps without drawing attention to the operating, because attention was what closed the gaps and forced the work back into the official channels that had already proven insufficient. So Harry had remained invisible at the civic level, and the city had accordingly had no civic relationship with him, and when he retired the city did not notice in any way that civic entities notice the departure of people who have mattered to them, because the city had never known that Harry mattered to it in any way that civic attention was equipped to register. The third layer was the most personal and the most permanent. The layer of individual lives that Harry had touched without their knowledge and that had continued without awareness of the touching. The woman on Clement Street was one entry in a category that contained hundreds. A man named Robert Chen who had been mugged in the Richmond in 1969 and had walked home shaken, not knowing that the person who had mugged him had been arrested 40 minutes later by a detective who had been watching the block on his own time after hours, and who had been off duty and operating without authorization and who had filed a report that listed the arrest as having occurred during an authorized patrol because the alternative was a use of force review he had no interest in navigating. Robert Chen had gone home, recovered, and lived the rest of his life without knowing that the detective who arrested his attacker had been there because he had been watching the block on personal time, without authorization, for reasons the official record would never capture. A woman named Diana Marsh, who had been followed home from the bus stop on 3 consecutive Thursdays by a man whose behavior Harry had identified as threatening through the kind of pattern recognition that came from years of watching exactly this kind of behavior develop, and whom Harry had confronted in a manner that the confrontation's invisibility in any official record made unverifiable, and who had not followed Diana Marsh home on the 4th Thursday or any Thursday thereafter. Diana Marsh had not known she was being followed. She had not known the threat had been removed. She had simply noticed, eventually, that the feeling of being watched on the bus had gone away, and had attributed this to her own changed behavior. She had started taking a different route, which she had not, or sitting in a different section of the bus, which she had not, or it had simply resolved itself, which was the explanation most consistent with her experience because it was the explanation that required no additional information she didn't have. The accumulation of these individual invisibilities was what Harry's 26 years had actually produced, in the largest and most accurate accounting. Not the closed case files, not the convicted defendants, not the formal record of an exceptional if institutionally problematic detective career, but the specific and enormous territory of ordinary life that had continued in its ordinary continuity because he had been present in the gaps that the ordinary life didn't know existed. This territory had no map. It had no official representation anywhere. It existed only in Harry's private accounting and in the completely uninformed lived experience of the people whose lives it constituted, and between Harry's knowledge of it and those people's experience of it there was no connection, no circuit, no mechanism through which what he knew and what they experienced could meet and produce the acknowledgement that the transaction had occurred. The gap between Harry's knowledge and the city's experience of itself was, in this sense, the same gap he had spent 26 years walking into from the other direction, the gap between what was officially known and what was actually true. He had walked into that gap to protect the city from threats it didn't know it had. He had walked out of it carrying a knowledge of protection extended that the city would never acknowledge receiving. The gap had been his life's work going in and his life's permanent condition coming out. What does a city owe the people who protect it without its knowledge? This question has no clean answer and Harry Callahan had never sought one, but the question is worth asking seriously rather than dismissing as unanswerable, because how a city relates to this debt, whether it acknowledges it, ignores it, or simply cannot see it, says something important about what the city understands itself to be and what it believes it owes to the people who make its ordinary life possible. San Francisco owed Harry Callahan an acknowledgement it was constitutionally incapable of making, not because the city was ungrateful in any intentional sense but because gratitude, at the civic level, requires awareness, and awareness requires visibility, and the most important parts of what Harry had done were precisely the parts that his doing had made invisible. The city had received a gift it could not see from a giver it had never recognized as such, and it had gone on receiving it for 26 years without any mechanism for accounting for it, and when the giver was gone it continued without him without noticing the specific shape of the absence, because the absence looked exactly like what had always been there. Ordinary San Francisco, beautiful and rotten and inexhaustible, producing its permanent argument with itself, apparently self-sustaining in the way that things appear self-sustaining when the mechanisms of their sustaining have been made invisible by their own success. Harry drove north. The city didn't wave. It never had. It never would. And somewhere on a windowsill on Clement Street, a small pot of coffee cooled in the morning air, put there by a woman who knew exactly why it felt right and had no idea what the rightness was made of. The officers who had worked alongside Harry in his last years. The ones who had been young enough when they started to have absorbed his legend before they absorbed his reality, who had arrived expecting the myth and found instead a tired, quiet, extraordinarily competent man who did not discuss his legend and did not perform it and who seemed, in the day-to-day texture of shared professional life, to be simply a detective with better pattern recognition and worse institutional instincts than most. These officers had their own relationship with the question of what the city owed Harry Callahan. They had seen enough of his work to understand, in the practical and unromantic way of people who work alongside exceptional people, that the exceptional quality was real and that its real quality was different from the legendary quality. The legend was about force and confrontation and the dramatic moments that generated stories. The reality was mostly patience. The hours in the car, the rereading of files, the attention paid to patterns that other investigators had not recognized as patterns, the specific and consistent willingness to spend personal time on professional problems without either recording the time or expecting acknowledgement for it. The legend was exciting. The reality was more impressive and considerably less dramatic, and these younger officers, who had seen both, carried a specific and private understanding of what they had worked alongside that the city at large would never have access to and that they had no adequate language for communicating to anyone who hadn't been there. Some of them tried, in the years after Harry's retirement, to tell pieces of the story in the informal ways that police officers tell stories. In break rooms and at retirement parties and in the particular late-night conversations that develop when investigators are waiting for something and the waiting creates space for the kind of talking that doesn't happen in official contexts. The pieces they told were accurate, individually. They told about the pattern recognition, about the cases that had been heading nowhere until Harry spent a weekend with the file and came back with a different question, about the specific quality of his presence in situations that called for someone to be present in a way that changed what the situation could become. These pieces were received with the mixture of respect and skepticism that stories about exceptional people always receive from people who didn't witness the exceptional firsthand, which is to say partially and imperfectly, in a way that kept the legend operational without adding much to the actual understanding of the man behind it. Harry's reality, the specific and unlegendary and enormously important reality of 26 years of consistent, invisible, unacknowledged work, remained where it had always been, in the negative space, in the territory of what hadn't happened, in the private ledger that nobody else had the data to read. The city of San Francisco continued to be saved, after Harry's departure, in ways that were differently visible and differently invisible, by different people with different methods and different accumulations of experience and different relationships with the gap between official process and actual outcome. None of them were Harry Callahan. None of them filled exactly the shape that his presence had occupied in the city's unofficial protective architecture. The shape was simply absent, and the city adapted to the absence the way living systems adapt to the removal of components, not by recognizing the removal but by redistributing the function across whatever remained, imperfectly and without acknowledgement that redistribution had occurred. The city did not miss Harry Callahan. Cities do not miss people. People miss people. Cities simply continue, incorporating absence into the texture of what they are the way they incorporate everything else. Without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without any visible sign that the specific thing that was present and is now absent had ever constituted part of what the city was. Harry had understood this about cities long before his retirement, and had made his peace with it in the same way he had made his peace with every other fact about San Francisco that did not bend to what he might have preferred it to be, which was to say by understanding it accurately and continuing to work within it rather than against it. Because working against a city's nature was a form of energy expenditure that produced nothing and cost everything, and Harry had always been too careful with his expenditures to waste them on gestures that changed nothing. The final accounting, the one that Harry carried north on the Tuesday morning in March and that would remain as a loan for the rest of his life, was not the accounting of cases closed or criminals convicted or the formal record of a 26-year career that the department would file and maintain according to standard retention schedules. It was the accounting of the Clement Street woman and Robert Chen and Diana Marsh and the 100 others like them, the accounting of ordinary mornings and safe apartments and bus rides that felt, inexplicably, less threatening than they had before. The accounting of everything the city had received from Harry Callahan without knowing it, without acknowledging it, without any of the mechanisms through which human beings normally confirm to each other that the things they have given have been received. Harry carried this accounting the way he carried everything else that belonged to him exclusively. Not prominently, not heavily, but steadily, as something that was simply true, that had been true for 26 years, and that would go on being true in the lives of the people whose lives it constituted, whether Harry was in the city or not, whether Harry was remembered or not, whether anyone ever added the ledger up or not. The ledger existed. The protection had been real. The woman on Clement Street would put out her coffee. The city would continue, saved and ungrateful and entirely unconscious of the saving, as cities do, as San Francisco always had, and Harry Callahan would drive north in the fog and know what he knew, which was everything that mattered and nothing that could be said, which had always been the precise and permanent condition of giving a city something it could never know it had received.